Are we working?
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this little seminar on soldering. Before I really sort of get going, I often refer to sort of Squires or Eileen's Emporium or any of those. I've no connection to any of those businesses apart from being a satisfied customer. However, Squires have provided the flux and solder, and also your solder, your flux brushes. So sort of thanks to Squires for providing that. Now, this is only going to be a basic trip into the world of soldering. Nothing too complicated. We're going to do a couple of basic joints, edge to edge. We've got a camera here, so once Peter gets his video set up, I'll solder a couple of pieces of brass together, and once I've done them and you sort of see what I do, you can have a go yourself with a couple of bits of brass and see how we get on. One thing you probably haven't got with you is any method of cleaning up your brass, but once I've done my little sort of soldering demo, we'll come to that, and I'll come around with something you can use to clean the brass up. Because one key to soldering, if the material you're soldering isn't clean, it is not going to solder. And cleanliness is the most important thing. Brass tends to tarnish very much like this piece here. It'll go this sort of brown colour. If you try and solder that, you just won't get anywhere with it at all. So you do need to make sure it's absolutely scrupulously clean, nice and bright and shiny like we've got there. This is a fiberglass stick, by the way. I'll talk about those as I come round. But you need to get your brass nice and clean before it will actually solder. Any chance we can have some video, Peter? Peter!
Peter! Do you want some video?
Can we have some video?
Yeah, it's all recording.
Oh, can we get it up on the screen?
Okay, I can't get it up on the screen, sorry, no.
Ah, right, I thought that was the whole point of this camera.
Stand around the table. I'd get them to come and stand around.
Yeah, if you want to come and stand around the table.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, gentlemen, I thought we'd got a...
Yeah, I haven't got enough USB links.
Right, what I've got here are basically two pieces of brass. They're both fairly new, what you would think are clean pieces of brass. But as you can see, I've just burnished this one up with a fiberglass pencil, and you can sort of see the difference between those two. But even though this is new, there's a layer of tarnish on there. So if we just burnish that up like so, and we'll do this one like so. And we're going to join these two pieces together with a fairly neat seam solder. Take some flux, find a flux brush, I've got one here somewhere. And all I'm going to do, I'm going to run just a line of flux down there like so. You can barely see it, but there is a line of flux down there. Okay. What I'm now going to do is just put a flux line down the edge of this piece here. This is not a liquid flux, obviously it's a paste flux. It's what my personal preference is for soldering. I'm using a 50 watt Antex iron. I've got some 145 solder that you should all now have. I'm just going to tin the tip of my iron like so. I should point out I've got asbestos fingers, but there we go. I'm just going to run a seam of solder down there like so. Okay. We just add a little bit more solder to that, because it is quite a long seam.
Looks like that from this.
And what I'm doing as well, I'm not removing the iron too quickly, I'm letting the heat of the iron go into the joint. So it allows the joint to come up to the temperature of the tip of the iron and allowing the solder to flow. Now if you've got any little bumps or pieces in that, we can just literally take the iron again and just literally run our iron over it and smooth it out.
You've done that before, haven't you?
Once or twice, yeah. There we go.
As you do that, you hope the joint goes pop.
Well, to be fair, it's going to solidify there and solidify there.
Right.
In reality, if we were soldering something like a solder bar on a coach, you'd be starting from the middle and working out. Because you can get a scenario with the heat from the iron that will cause the metal to expand and it will cause it to distort slightly. So what we'll do, we'll have a go at that, shall we? With some of those bits of scrap that I gave you. I'll come round with a fiberglass block and a little bit of wet and dry paper. And I've got some in here. This one. So you need to clean the brass out first of all. So there we go. Get the good polish up. You can also use some wet and dry. You should always just wipe them on a damp sponge. And I've emphasised a damp sponge rather than a wet sponge, because if your sponge is too wet, you can actually sort of shock the iron base. You're cooling it down too quickly, which, to be frank, the element doesn't like. So just keep the sponge sort of moist, damp, not sort of saturated in water. If that's not working very well, I'm sort of using this often referred to as brass turnings. That will also keep the tip nice and bright. You need to keep the tip nice and bright. The next stage of the game, if that's not doing too well, is to use some tip cleaner. And that will always bring up the tip of your iron nice and clean. Unless of course the tip is beyond its life expectancy when it comes to the point where you've got to change the tip. But with the fluxes that we tend to use in brass construction, it does tend to attack the tip of the iron, so you may find that over a period of time you've got to replace the tips of your iron. Okay, the solder we've been using is 145 solder. It's 145 degrees solder, melts at 145 degrees. For those of you that have got the adjustable irons, the solder stations, it probably pays to have those set around twice the melting point of the solder, 300 degrees, 340, something of that order, to sort of get the best out of your iron, to get the best joints as we've been getting with these other ones that we've done here. Mine I've got set about 346. It's one of the Antex irons. They are quite a nice iron. This is a fairly old Weller iron. They're known as a Magnastat iron because they have a Magnastat in them, so it's temperature control, but I've got no adjustment on that apart from changing the bits. They're getting a little bit long in the tooth now. One of the other things we could look at, I'm not going to get you to do this, but I will just give you some brief insight into soldering white metal, because it's something that I'm often asked about. Can you solder white metal? Yep, you can solder white metal. You need white metal solder and you need white metal flux. Sorry? Yeah, you can come up, gather around, have a look. If I can find enough bits of scrap white metal. Right, so I'm soldering some white metal. What happened to my flux, to my fiberglass thing? It disappeared somewhere. Thank you. Right, always give it a little scrub up anyway. A lot of people are frightened of soldering white metal because it melts so easily, and if you use the wrong iron, I'll just hold that with a pair of, if we use a large iron on that, you'll see white metal will just literally melt. It'll melt like solder melts. So it's a little bit of a task perhaps to solder. What I tend to use is a very small iron, a little 15 watt Antex here. Keep that nice and clean. Now I do tend to use a liquid flux for white metal because I find it simply makes a better joint. So all I'm going to do is dribble some flux onto there.
Is that phosphoric acid?
It is basically phosphoric acid. Yep. That's all it is. So we're just going to get some white metal solder on the tip of my iron there. Actually, most of it's gone on the cutters at the moment. But there we go.
Temperature solder is that?
This melts at about 70 degrees.
70 degrees solder.
Yeah. So literally all I've got to do now is just run that on there. I need a little bit more flux on that. And this iron isn't powerful enough to melt the white metal. Just literally the white metal solder. I'll let that flash off. A little more flux on there, I'm afraid. It evaporates, I think, at the time I was talking.
So in essence you're trying to get it capillary into it.
Capillary into the joint, and then we're there. That's it, we've got it this time round. I'll let that just flash off, and then we've now got those two pieces of white metal joined securely.
Looks like it's the front edge.
Right, so the principle is just the same, but you don't need to use a big iron for white metal. A little small 15 watt iron like that, or one of these literally turned right down with a small tip, will deal with pretty much anything in white metal. The other thing we tend to get is soldering white metal to brass. For instance, if you're fitting buffer stocks to a wagon or something like that, you can solder white metal to brass using the white metal solder. Just tin the brass with a little bit of white metal solder, then literally just sweat the two together with some white metal flux. I tend to use this.
Like some distance from
Yeah, hold the iron a little bit away from it so the heat goes through the brass, and just let the solder flash off that way. Right, I hope I've uncovered a few mysteries of soldering. Anything else you'd like to know? Any questions?
I was going to ask that about white metal to brass, but you just explained it.
Right, white metal to brass, yeah. If you need to see anything in a little more detail, I'm down on D2, demonstration 2. So once I've finished here, I should be back on the stand. Or when I've gone and had a drink to sort of sort out the vocal cords a bit.
The reason I came today is I tried to build something and it didn't really work out very well.
Sorry, what was that?
I tried to build something, it didn't really work very well. And one of the things I found that I was doing is I was spilling pools of solder, it's like onto the model I was trying to build.
You've
So
got too much solder on the tip of the iron, or the tip of the iron isn't clean enough to receive the solder. Once the tip of the iron becomes dirty and you try and put solder on it, it'll just literally fall off. So you need to keep the tip of that iron nice and clean, as I've just showed you with the tip cleaners and the various sponges.
Do you do that every time you used it?
Sometimes you just,
On the joint?
well yeah, I'm sort of the habit of every time I use the iron, I just sort of do that on the sponge and just keep it clean, because it needs to look like that for the solder to actually take on it. That's the 145 there. So that will now just sit on the tip there and not fall off.
Yeah, I'm falling off.
Yeah.
So, on the model I was showing you, I was sort of large flat plates, sort of solid plates in the frame, and then of course there's lots of bits going on it.
Yes.
So, I can't recall, but I think I started with like 178 on that because I was afraid of desoldering when I started putting all the other bits on.
Solder doesn't melt that.
Right.
You can.
So I shouldn't need to be worried that much, should I?
If you think about that little piece we soldered up earlier on, by the time you got to the other end, the first end had actually cooled off and dried. It didn't go all the way through.
Right. Of course, because I was putting up lots of other bits around.
It's one of these things. The best way to dry it comes in practice.
Of course.
And if you start with something like one of Jim's kits, Jim McGowan's kits, one of his pocket money arranger kits, they're a very good starting point for working in brass. I mean, I'd say don't go out and buy a Duchess kit as your first kit. Go out and buy sort of a £30 wagon or something. Yeah. Try that to start with.
With some of his kits are specifically designed to give you
The basic skills.
Yeah, they are.
Who was that again? Sorry.
That's that connoisseur model. Jim McGowan.
Connoisseur,
Yeah.
He did one of those an evening whips, didn't he?
He did. Jim did an evening with. What I will just show you is, I've been talking about transporting solder on the tip of the iron, which you do when you're not using a resin core solder, which this is. This is the sort of thing you do printed circuit board with. I'm sure Peter's probably more familiar with that than I am. But if you're using this solder, you don't put this on the tip of the iron and take it to the joint. If you put this on the tip of the iron, which I'm about to do, all that smoke is your flux burning away. You do not want the flux burning away, you want the flux down there. So if we were going to sort of add a wire onto that, so they don't mind the floor. So what we will do is bear with me while I unravel this. While I find the end. That will do for the purpose of this. Find a pair of cutters or something, excuse me. Now I'd normally twist those strands together like that. Now, I call this the chopstick method. But what you can do is you've got a piece of blue tack or something, which I've probably got in here somewhere. No, I haven't up to date. But you can either clamp it onto your bench with something substantial or a piece of blue tack just to do this particular operation. I'll do it the way I normally do it, which is just by literally tinning the end, like so. Right, that's now nicely tinned. I'll just trim that to length, like so. If we're going to solder that onto a piece of track or a terminal. And then my next operation, we'd probably do the same. We'd put a little blob of solder on there by putting the iron on first, like so. Just add our solder in. We've got a neat little blob on there, like that. And then just sweat the two together. Iron off, job done.
It's all about being quick, isn't it?
It's all about being quick, so that's basically what you end up with. That's probably hot on the end, so don't burn your fingers. But that's basically how you would make a sound joint with this piece of wire.
So one of the things that obviously I was seeing, and I know I've got in my kit, is there's various, I'm trying to think, we would call it plates. And obviously you would, I think the notion is you tin the end of the plates.
Yep.
Do you tin both parts?
Are we talking about?
Or you then bring them together?
Are we talking about if you bring two pieces together like that?
Well, that's one, and then also where yes, in essence, but where you might have that as a sort of 90 degree and that's a flat plate.
Oh right,
yeah,
so
yeah.
You're talking sort of that arrangement, or
no? So that would be 90 degrees,
yeah.
And then you'd be placing the 90-degree piece on there, so it's like a bracket coming off it.
Oh right, like
yeah,
that.
So it's, sorry.
It's a pair of pliers for that.
If you go, oh I see, yeah, I'm with you.
This is obviously
Okay.
the right type of thing. But yeah, normally, well, I understood. What I would do is tin that, obviously.
Yep. Okay.
And then you.
Right.
Obviously, that's not very
Let me just grab
engineering
a
sort of
Let
situation.
me grab a pair of pliers.
Proper pair of pliers.
Yeah, those blue ones would be fantastic. So in essence, that's what you're.
That's
what you're after.
it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll just clean that up,
Okay.
and we'll go back to the 145 solder. I'll put some flux on there. I'll pick up some 145 solder. Just take the crud off the tip of the iron. Right, see how that's tin? Clean?
Yeah.
Right.
And just go a nice thin coat across it or whatever. Or
Right, now what we can do, we just got a nice thin coat on there. I'm just going to clean up there. We're going to mount that anywhere on there.
Okay.
The light over here is not spectacular. Can't see it's been cleaned. There we are. That's it. Then we need to put some flux on that. Sorry, Peter.
That's all right.
I know you're trying to film.
No, it's okay.
I'm going to do this backhanded so you can probably see. Knock off the excess solder, and now what I'm going to do is put some heat on there. And this is where I would personally probably be using a resistant soldering iron, which I'd use an RSU unit. If you come and see me on stand
Right.
DO2, we'll explain that.
Okay.
And we're just letting the heat go through there now. Hopefully by now we should have soldered. This is now where I end up with egg on my face. There we go, I've just seen the solder flash off, right?
Yeah, you see the solder wicking at the edges. Yeah, so that's just.
That's where you need quite a powerful iron. Right. So that's what you now end up with.
Brilliant. Yep.
That's hot, so
Excellent.
okay.
Yeah. Exactly what I was trying to achieve.
What about an overlay, Rob?
An overlay is virtually the same principle, except with an overlay, this is basically what you're talking about.
The top one's really thin.
Yeah, the top one's really thin. So you've got a couple of options. We could tin this, we could flax our overlay, or we could tin and flax our overlay, lay it on, and then literally work around the edge with an iron.
The edge.
You can let the heat go through, or from the back with the iron.
Flash across.
Yeah,
Start in the middle again, like
start in the middle again, but try and work on the back of it rather than on the front where you've got all the detail.
Makes sense.
Again, that's where if you come down onto my demo stand down there, I'll show you what an RSU is, and that is a great tool for the job.
Right.
But they're an expensive bit of kit. But if you're serious about building, they're always a worthwhile tool to have.
What about nickel silver? Is it the same process?
Nickel silver solders beautifully. In fact, it could be argued that nickel silver is possibly better than brass to solder.
Okay.
The heat tends to remain more localised. I actually prefer working nickel silver to brass, but
I've read about it, starting the big constructions with a higher temperature solder and then working your way
yes,
down.
you can do that. You
Want to know?
can. Yes, you can start with say 180 solder, then drop down to 145. Generally speaking, I've never had problems with just using 145 throughout. The only exception I would make to that is that sometimes if I'm adding fine detail to something, I will use probably one of the electrical solders, which is probably 190, 200 degrees, something in that order, and just tin it with that.
When you do
using a separate flux.
Okay.
Yeah, using a separate flux, just tin it with this, because it's that little bit stronger than the 145.
Alright.
If you've got something like a lamp iron or something like that,
Yeah.
it just has
It's small, but it's got to stay.
yeah,
A
it's
very
good.
small
Yeah,
area to
yeah, a very small area to solder.
And separate flux as well.
Yeah, use a separate flux. That's the only occasion I'll probably use a separate flux with an electrical solder, is if I'm doing something
the
for
higher
detail.
temperature.
Because it's a higher. Well, it's only because that I use it in the same way as I'm using that by putting it on the iron and taking it to the job.
Right.
So therefore, I burnt all the flux away. So I just add a little bit of extra flux in. Anybody else got any queries? Yeah.
Really useful.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Very encouraging.
I hope that's been informative for you.
Yeah, that's
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you manage to hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The speaker helped.
Oh yeah. Yes, yeah.